Hey, Shavua Tov, everybody. Happy, last night we counted the 36th day of the Omer. Okay, so we're getting close. That means we're just a couple of weeks away from Shavuot, great day of Revelation. So Revelation is at hand. And there's another great reason to celebrate today. One of our most beloved and friends in this circle, Yonatan Reches, is celebrating his birthday today. So let's all sing together. We can even unmute. Happy birthday to you.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear
Yonatan. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, Yonatan. And Yonatan is going to be celebrating his birthday now regularly at the same time of year that his daughter does. Yonatan just recently had a baby girl, just what was it, a week ago? Just a beautiful and precious baby girl, Chana. So Yonatan actually will be kind of, I think, well positioned in our conversation today to think about the old and the young, the older and the younger, and to think about it. What we're going to think about today. Let me just say that the actual topic is spiritual development. Spiritual development. How do we develop spiritually? We develop in so many ways. But how do we develop spirit? What does it mean to develop spiritually? And so, in one sense, we're going to have a conversation that is about cognitive development. Like, what is the cognitive faculty that we might associate with spiritual development? I'm not even sure that the merger of that terminology is accurate exactly, but you get what I'm saying. And in that sense, there's something very kind of almost scientific about this question. It's a curiosity. How do we think of how can we measure such a thing? But for me, this question, I've thought a lot about this question, the question of what kind of spiritual education do we get? Should we get? Did I get? Could I have gotten? Right? Those questions occupy me because I came to religious study later in my life, in my early 20s, and I have always, because of that, felt like I was like behind the eight ball, like trying to catch up. But for my misspent youth, I would have been studying the Torah when I was a boy, and it would be in my bones, and it would just be natural to me, and I wouldn't have to stumble over things, and I wouldn't have to re-educate myself. There's too much. Look at these books behind me. You think I've read all of these books? You think I will ever read all of these books? And these are just like a fraction of all the books that you have to read to be able to understand what the heck is going on here in this beautiful tradition. And so there's a part of me that feels like, but for a misspent youth. But then there's another part of me that feels like, as a Baal Tshuva, as someone who came to religion later in life, my religiosity is adult. It's something that when I started to look for God, I was looking with an adult mind, and my yearnings were adult yearnings. I don't think I had those yearnings as a child, not exactly, or I don't know, but we could talk. That's part of what I want to talk about. When do we start to develop a faculty for spiritual life and contemplation? And does it start young, or is there something about, just to, not to do the introduction forever, but just to put it in one last question, there is a part of me that wonders whether we ought to give religious education to children at all. In other words, let them be. Like, And then when we come into some kind of awakening, is it 13? Is it 16? Is it 60? Like some kind of, like our mind begins to mature, and then we suddenly begin to ask bigger questions. Maybe that makes more sense. Maybe spiritual education should begin later. So I think about these things, and I don't have a child, but I might one day, and I wonder these things. And I wonder if Yonatan is wondering these things. And I think we can all wonder these things, whether we have children or not. What was our own spiritual education? When did we, or have we begun to awaken or want to awaken? So those are some of the questions we're going to be thinking about today. Let's say a blessing over our sacred study, okay? That ends la'asok b'divrei Torah, to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, so as we have been doing, we're going to take a look now at, let's see if I have the source sheet ready at hand for you. We're going to take a look at a Mishnah in Avot, in Pirkei Avot, because it is the season. In the time between Passover and Shavuot, we traditionally study Masechet Avot, the ethical teachings of the rabbis. And in fact, we're going to look today, our first Mishnah is going to be a Mishnah that last year, when we had we had already headed inside, the pandemic had already gone, but last year we had begun a study of Pirkei Avot, and we studied this Mishnah. And actually, Andrea is going to do me the favor of giving you links to last year's class. Because you could take a look, first of all, you can take a look at all of our classes online. We save all of our classes. And this one I think wasn't videoed, but it was audioed. So there's that. But there's also just the source sheet. And it's an interesting teaching we're going to look at today. Mostly last year, we looked at the background of the teacher, Elisha ben Abuya, because he was the famous heretic in rabbinic history. The rabbi who decided this is all nonsense. I cannot abide, the rabbi who gave up the faith. But he also did a lot of core teaching. So just that's an asterisk. Okay, there's a class out there if you want to explore the background of this teacher, Elisha ben Abuya. But what we're going to do is just use the teaching as a kind of pshat. Like what's the basic message here? And then we're going to dive into to the thought of the Piazzettes Rebbe. And I'll tell you a little bit about him before we start, the Eish Kodesh. Okay, so let's take a look. Yes, someone just said in the chat, is he the other? That's right, Acher, the other. That's the way he's referred to in the tradition, the other. But so that's interesting, but there's a whole class for you out there if you want to look at the background of this figure that is both in and out of the tradition. But this is what he taught. And this is what we're going to use as our kind of starting point today. So let's just what's called get the pshat, meaning let's just get a basic understanding of what this teaching is, and then once we have that, we'll be able to take, as we have been doing, a kind of a more mystical approach, a Hasidic approach to this teaching. So Elisha ben Abuya said, here it is. Elisha ben Abuya said, one who learns when a child, Halomed Yeled, Lamahu Domeh, is compared to what? What do you compare someone who learns when they're a child to ink written on new paper? Okay, fresh paper or parchment, maybe is a better word. And one who learns when in old age is compared to what? To ink written on paper that has been erased, or just been written on and erased. That's sort of it just says that erased paper. Okay, so I just filled in the idea. Okay, so one who learns, a child is learning is like ink being written on fresh paper. An old person learning is like ink being written on blurry, used paper. Okay, now, before we start arguing with this, and then this whole thing, I mean, it's triggering for me as well, right? I started learning late, so I'm like, wow, I missed out. But before we start reacting to it, I want to just, the actual teaching is is one position, and then the Mishnah goes on and complicated. By the end of that Mishnah on your page, you'll see that Rebbe is saying, oh, don't pay any attention. Don't look at the container, but look what's in the container. Like, come on, don't get, like, there seems to be some argument, and we spent, as I said, an hour talking about this last year. But let's just get the shot. Let's just get the basic understanding of what is the pedagogy in here, or what is the cognitive theory in here of learning. That why is it that when you learn something young, it's like fresh paper, and when you learn something old, it's like blurry erased paper? Anyone be able to speak that out for me? Because it doesn't totally make sense. I think
sorry.
Oh yeah, Marianka, yeah.
It just made me think, the concept of fresh paper made me think of Locke's tabula rasa, right? There's nothing written on it. And so the older ages, that tablet or that piece of paper is now written, there's lots of experience written on it.
Beautiful. That's a nice pull. And Marianka often gives us a nice pull, just sort of like grabs a reference from somewhere in civilization. So yes, right. The tabula rasa, the blank slate, and the idea that, you know, and Locke talks about this, that our minds are like this open blank slate, and anything can be written on it. There's a similar imagery here, that we start, maybe it's the paper then is like the mind, like we are open to, and it'll just the first impression on the mind. So that's when you're learning young, it's like the first impression. But so what? Why does that matter? Why is that helpful? Why is that? Or actually, I don't know. The Mishnah hasn't said it's good or bad. I'm already putting my value judgments on it. Kate Silberstein, what do you think?
I thank you. Marianka really said it, but I'm thinking that when we learn young, we're really just taking at face value what the teacher is telling us. That in many ways we don't challenge it, we take it as fact. Mm-hmm. And that when we're older and we bring all those experiences and the rest of everything that we've learned to the table, then we're making very different, we're taking very different judgments about it. We can question it. Whereas children, we don't always question.
I love it. You know, this group is too sophisticated for the shot. Meaning, like, we're already reading past and these are interesting, kind of more nuanced readings. Like, maybe it isn't necessarily such a, or at least more nuanced than the most classical reading. It isn't. Maybe there's something about being a new learner that isn't ideal. You just have to take everything in. Maybe being an older learner and writing on that erased paper gives you a kind of a sense of the history of things, the nuance of things, the blurriness of truth. Okay, but that, I must say, that is already a sophisticated reading, because I think there's the traditional reading of this Mishnah, or at least the first pass at it, suggests that there's something nice and clear about your learning when you're young, and that there's something that's like now difficult or obscured about your learning when you get older. So I'm not actually, now that you've talked, I'm like, oh, is that the pshat? Is that the simplest reading of this? I don't know, but it's at least one simple reading of it that's out there that I think our text is going to respond to. Okay, so thinking in terms of cognitive development, what does it mean that when you're young, you have a fresh piece of paper, and that might be a good thing? So think about like learning languages, for example, and how easily we absorb languages when we're young. And I know that when I try to learn new languages now, the old languages actually pop out of my, I'll speak Spanish and I'm trying to say something in Hebrew. I'll speak, because my brain it's like now, it's not a good brain. What can I say? It's like, can't hold it all. And there's too much jumbling around in there. And okay, so that's one version of the chat. Let's get one more thought before we head into our teaching for the day. Elizabeth?
So related to what you just said, that was what I was going to say. It's not so much good or bad, but as we get older, we don't remember things as well. And when you're young, the things you learn are really there for life. So a lot of the prayers and the songs and the traditions and the music of the language, if you will, are there forever if you got them when you were young. And if you didn't, like I didn't, and supposedly you probably didn't, it takes a lot more effort to learn them as you get older. But yes, you are more critical of it. You are more able to look at it in a critical way. So
okay, good. Okay, good. So that's so Elizabeth gives some more language to this idea that it's in you when you're young, and then it feels more natural to you because you sort of absorbed it completely then, and then it stays in you. So what it means for me to jumble through the prayers when I started to learn them in my 20s, it's just not, they're not this, it's hard. I'm moving through this difficult language, and I'm trying to remember everything as I go, and it's just a little hard. It requires a little more concentration. And so it's just perhaps distracting me from the prayer experience. And then what does it mean to start learning the prayers when you're 40, 60, right? So these are vexing questions, I think, because I'm not the only person who started studying Judaism later in life, and Judaism's so hard. There's so much to learn. So for any of us who are, somewhere through life's journey, becoming more interested in developing this path, what does that mean for us if this teaching seems to be suggesting that it's harder to learn things when you're old, right? Though there may be perspective, and there may be nuance, and there may be texture, and there may be great readings out there of how this Mishnah can be flipped on its head, it's also like there's blurriness, there's obscurity, there's like a difficulty. It's not fresh, it's not clear. Okay, all right. I would love to continue just analyzing this Mishnah, but I want to get us into the material that really is at hand today, which is the Piazzettes Rebbe. So the Piazzettes Rebbe, Rebbe Kalanimus Kalman Shapiro, or Shapira, is most famously the Eish Kodesh. In other words, the book that was published posthumously, a collection of his sermons that he gave in the Warsaw Ghetto during the Holocaust, and then were buried underground and discovered later. And they are incredible and beautiful and sophisticated and heartbreaking. Because you can feel the tone get worse and worse throughout the book. There's some really, just to study the Eish Kodesh and it's in the context of the Holocaust, is an incredible and difficult experience, but he's known for that, the Rebbe of the Warsaw Ghetto, but you're not the Rebbe unless you've been doing things for a while, and he had been a teacher and a major thinker in Poland in the 20s and 30s before the Holocaust. And he was known, I'll just say this and then we'll dive in. He was known especially before the Holocaust, he was known especially for his book, Chovot HaTalmidim, the obligations of a student. What are a student's obligations? And that should tell you, it's a book written to young, probably young men, teenagers, bachurim, he uses that term. So, but it's written to young people that he's teaching, and he was a pedagogue, he was a teacher, he was a malamed. It was he had a yeshiva, but also like a schoolhouse, a cheder, and he was sort of known as a teacher. So he's exactly the right person to be thinking about pedagogy and cognitive development, and especially spiritual cognitive development, okay? And that's exactly where he goes here. He takes this Mishnah that we've just learned, and he takes it to, and here's the mystic piece of our ethical study. He takes this teaching, and he takes it straight to a spiritual place. What does it mean not just to learn, but to learn spiritually? So let's take a look at what he says here. He says, the Mishnah says in Avot 4:20, one who learns as a child is compared to what? To ink written on new paper, and one who learns when in old age is compared to what? To ink written on paper that has been written on and erased. So now look at his opening here. Kain hu b'chol ha'inyanim, and so it is in all matters. Hen b'limud ha'pashut, whether in straightforward study, v'hen b'chasidut v'tikun ha'nefesh, or in chasidut and tikun ha'nefesh. These are kind of just paltry translations, but just so we have a chasidut, sometimes translated as piety, but it is also the whole word for their movement. So a certain kind of spiritual piety, seeking, going further than beyond the normal, like spiritual yearning. And the Hasidic tradition. Part of what he's saying is the study of our Hasidic mystical tradition. So whether you're studying, and now one wonders, what is straightforward study? Is it math? Or is it, I suspect, just regular Torah? You know, I mean, what was Elisha ben Abuya talking about? Was he talking about math or regular Torah? You know, like, the laws of Judaism, the basics, the stories, whatever it is, there's something else called chasidut and tikkun nefesh, piety and soul repair. And he's going to give a little bit more language to this in the next couple of sentences. So let's just see what he means before we pan out a little bit and try and figure out what we think of it. For there are many people, he says, who know what service and self-improvement are. Okay, so that's the other language, service and self-improvement. So being in divine service, being in spiritual service, and being in the process of self-improvement, self-development, okay? For all of that, I'm just gonna repeat this one more time. For all of that work, there's a young version. What is it like when you do it when you're young? And there's an old version. And I think he's gonna give us the old version first. The old version first. But let me just say, it's not just young and old, it's someone who is well-seasoned, you know, in learning, and someone who is starting late. How about that? All right. It's not necessarily, that could mean a lot of things. But okay, here we go. And so let's see, where are we? Okay, so this is sort of like the person who didn't start studying young, okay? There are many people who know what service and self-improvement are, yearn for it, and even force themselves to do it. They force themselves to do it. Nevertheless, they spend all of their years just coercing and forcing themselves, and are constantly, this is an interesting phrase here, they're constantly hopping between two lines. In Hebrew, v'tamid poschim hem al beit seifim. They're like going back and forth to like, I don't know what he means by that, but I sort of do. Like, have I got it yet, or am I there yet? It's like constantly like, am I ahead or behind, like just back and forth. This is me, by the way. Maybe this is you. It's like I yearn for it, and I forced myself, I disciplined myself to get this spiritual education, but I always feel like I'm pushing myself. I'm constantly hopping between two lines. Such a person will occasionally force themselves to work for a half an hour or an hour, I guess, on their spirituality. Like, I'll set aside a half an hour to meditate. I'll do it. But then falls right back to being like they were before. But then I'm like yelling at someone an hour later. Okay. And then they force themselves, fall again, and force themselves once more. And they spend their years this way without even making one step forward. I mean, this is really pretty sad. They will not elevate themselves from, oh, you see, I regendered this. They will not elevate themselves from their state, just so we could all be in it, because they spend their choicest abilities and their best years hopping and falling. Psichav al hanifila. Okay. And then he's about to say, but you're not like this, precious young people. Okay, so before he gives like the good word to the precious young people, the rest of us would like to say something. Excuse me, Mr. Piazzettes Rebbe. Okay, so let's try and understand, first of all, what he is saying. And then, of course, I want to think, does this experience feel familiar? Do you agree with this? He starts off with this Mishnah that when you're old and you're learning, it's like rubbing, it's like writing something on rubbed paper. So there's something, but so he says it's like that way with not just learning things, languages, math, other things, that straightforward laws, but in your spiritual development, you know, if you come at it later, then you find yourself, you're trying to push yourself there, you're trying to get yourself there, you want it, but like you just, you never really make any progress. It's all about, you spend your whole time just being like, I gotta do this, I gotta get more spiritual, Now, does that feel familiar, or is that a ridiculous character? What do you think of that? And maybe start by telling me, what is he saying? What is his pedagogical, psychological teaching here? Okay, what do we think? Payam Emrani.
He's talking about will versus grace, that when we're older, it's an act of will for either study or spirituality, or, you know, but children are in a natural state of grace, that they don't need to work at it because they're just born, you know, elevated. And since he is a Hasidic, you know, there's the concept of you start off with the light, and then the light keeps on going around it and blocks it. And so a little bit of it's coming out. So it's the continuation of the Hasidic teaching of the inner light in people.
Okay, great. Okay, so that's interesting where Payam started to go. I wanted to start with your first binary of will and grace, which is, you know, great sitcom, but also a great way of thinking about how it just takes more effort and energy when you're older. You have to summon a lot of will to push yourself to grow. And there's some Payam's not necessarily teaching this. He's just saying this is what the Piazzettes and Rebbe seems to be saying, that therefore you don't have that kind of natural grace, that little gift from God, that little boost and then Payam started to formulate a slightly different way to say that, like, you have this pure divine light, you come into the world with that. And then I started to think, so it's as if like that light has been occluded or lost, or so there's like some kind of, now it takes more energy to uncover the light. Okay, but I saw Florine shaking her head vigorously. Do not agree with this. So what do you think, Florine?
Science already knows that there are parts of the brain that are spiritual and there are parts of the brain that are cognitive, and that sometimes they interact. So I truly believe that children have a very beautiful spiritual side, and that later they study, so the cognitive part interacts. There's an interrelationship with the spiritual side. In my case, I started studying when I was 60, but I always knew I was a spiritual person. And I believe that the studying part, the cognitive part, worked to integrate, to apply, and to transform. But I believe, unlike most people that seem to look at old age a certain way, I believe that old age is the opportunity for great elevation. And I took a Rebbe Salmon's course on aging into saging, and it was very instrumental in my, not just in my secular life, but in my spiritual life, that I could feel this elevation. And I think that the problem is that we talk ourselves out of that. I don't particularly like what was written, because I think it's based on knowledge before knowledge.
Great. Florine, thank you so much. Florine has given us so much beautiful language to use here, to think about. First of all, Florine does talk about the possibility of a certain kind of, like Payam, a certain kind of intuitive, natural kind of spirit that even that the young possess. And so there is the capacity to start perhaps developing that early. But that, Florine says, is distinct from that we all have, actually. That's not something you either have or don't. We all have that capacity, Florine suggests, but there is the cognitive, like the intersection of cognitive development and how we focus on the development of our spiritual capacity. And indeed, you may not do that as early in life as somebody else. And then it is a learning. You have to actually learn that. And then that might actually be harder. So you might have a more difficult time using the tools of religion, for example, to enhance your spiritual development, or the tools of music and poetry to enhance, but whatever it is, that stuff you do have to. But then Florine ends by saying, but it's also true that there's something about age that grants certain benefits. And this is what I was talking about at the outset of the class. It's something about being more developed that opens you up to a different kind of yearning and a different kind of wisdom and a different ability to process the ideas that you're learning in this sort of cognitive process. So there are advantages there too. And who's to say, and Florine didn't really like the very sharp, binary being drawn here. Who's to say whether it's better to be older or younger when you're trying all this stuff? Okay. Let's take one more comment, and then we're going to push a little forward and see. I think the Piazzettes Rebbe will surprise us a little bit as we move forward. So, Hannah.
Okay, I'm ready to be surprised. But so far, I'm with Florine on a lot of this. But I find it interesting because this description feels much more to me like people who learn as kids than people who come to it later. I feel like the opposite about it, because it reminds me of all the people I know who grew up observant or who grew up learning in these environments where they were given very strict boundaries and expectations, and they were told, this is what you have to do. Spirituality is important. God is important. These rules are important. You have to learn this text. You have to memorize this text. You have to know this text. And so they were jumping back and forth between these two lines because they were 7 or they were 12 or they were 14. And they felt so torn between, okay, but I want to be with my friends. I want to be in the world. And then it's like, oh, but I have to read, like I have to learn Mishnah. Oh, but I want to go to the mall. No, I have to learn Talmud. Like whatever the things were that feels very childish to me. This understanding of someone has given me this rigid understanding of the world, and I'm trying to navigate that, but I'm also trying to figure out who I am, and I'm not just that. And so that the inability to focus and the inability to stay in something for a long period of time feels very young to me, and feels like what you do when you're told this matters, and you're like, does it matter to me, or does it just matter because someone told me it matters? And that actually those of us who come to this later, I also came to this later, that we have more of a sense of this matters because I chose it. So I can focus on it. I can bring some other understanding and wisdom to it. And like Florine said, she started learning even later that there's a different understanding of I'm taking this on for me. And there's much less jumping back and forth because I'm not doing it because my mom told me you have to learn a certain amount of Mishnah. And I'm not doing it because my school told me you're already behind. I'm doing it because I want this for me. And this spirituality is important because I chose it and because my relationship with God and my relationship to the world matters to me. But that's from me, and that feels more honest and less jumpy to me.
Great. That's great. Hannah just did such beautiful work for us. We're going to take those ideas and Hannah's already given us a lens that we can use to process what's coming. So your intuitions are spot on when she says that there's actually something that feels kind of young in this description. And isn't this the way it is for young people? But hold on, let's just pause, because Hannah gave us something else that I think is crucially important in this conversation, if it is to be a real conversation about, the questions I was asking at the beginning, like when is it really, what do we do with our children? What do we tell our children? What do we want to be told as children? And Hannah reminds us, and I know it to be very true, in my journey, from my journeying through religious worlds and educational settings, that a lot of people who have religion shoved on them when they're young, they hate it because it was all rules and memorization and may I add to that, and a very childish understanding of God. Because what do we tell our children? I mean, You know, you can't be like, well, God is the abstract oneness of all creation that interconnects being. It's the Grundnorm. You know, it's like, no, you say like, God loves us and God saved us from Egypt. And then suddenly you're like, wait, this got, so there's many layers of a kind of frustration with the process of being schooled in religion that actually may turn you off from it. And isn't that a factor here too? What is our experience of learning? Okay, I see Devin's hand come up, but I'll come back to you if it's still relevant. I just want to push forward a little bit because we haven't actually gotten to the youth, and this is what I thought was going to be a little bit surprising, but I think Hannah's comments bridge us there, because Payam and Florine intuited, and I think wisely, that he seems to be privileging youth, and therefore youth should be, it's really hard when you're old. It should be really natural and easy when you're young. And in a way, he does say that there's something about being young that makes it a little easier, but look at his description, because it doesn't sound all that easy. It sounds actually a lot more like what Hannah was describing, that it's like for a young person. And so the binary is not as sharp as it first appears. Let's take a look at what he says. And he turns, by the way, and he speaks to his students. Lo kenatem bachurei chemed, but you are not like this, precious young people. You are not like that. You're not all of this hopping between two lines. That's not you. If you begin from your childhood and work on this from your youth, Chassidut, piety, will become your flesh and blood. So there's that Elizabeth language. It's just in me. It's just in me. But if he doesn't stop talking about falling, even if you do fall, he says, you will not retreat. And even if you will sometimes stagnate, you will not sink into the swamp. That's the language he uses. And you will not need to spend all of your time trying not to fall and just raising yourself up from the dirt and the mud. Your main work will only be to elevate yourselves. And then he has a metaphor here. So now just note, it's not that you don't fall, rather, when you do fall, you get back up. Okay. But was that really so different from the earlier description? I'm going to ask you that soon. But he gives us a metaphor here, and this is really interesting. The metaphor of the mountain climber. Even your falls, he says, and the times of your acting small will be like those of a mountain climber. He too sometimes gets tired and occasionally injures his foot. Still talking about injury, falling, damage, struggle. But even then, he does not fall or go down. He rests and continues to climb, bandages his foot a little, and continues the trek. What a great metaphor here. And you too will always ascend and always reveal the greatness that is within you. Okay? So let's just stop here for a second. What's the advantage to youth? Because it like Hannah said, it actually seems a lot like the same thing. It's like having to do things over and over again, falling and stuff. But why is he turning to the youth and saying, you're so lucky because it's different for you? Let me turn to Matt, who's got a hand up.
He is saying that the youth won't just do the same thing. They won't keep falling and going back to the exact same place. They're going to move forward. But I have another comment I would like to make.
Okay, all right. Well, hold on one sec. So I just want to speak this out, because you gave us the answer the shot answer that we need, which is that there's something about being young that it's not that you don't fall. It's just that somehow that you don't fall in the same way. You fall and move forward. There's a progression even with all the falling that is the special privilege of youth. But you have another comment. Go ahead.
Which is that when I'm teaching kids, I tell them it's so special to be learning when you're a kid. And if I'm teaching adults, I'm going to tell them it's so special that you're learning when you're an adult, because I can only learn today. This whole thing about which is better is utterly meaningless in a sense, because I'm 63 and I can only learn as a 63-year-old. I don't have the option of saying, okay, now I'm going to be young and then a fresh slate and I could, no. I
Okay.
can, there is only today.
Okay, very, very well said. And we're all learning just today, and we all came to this when we came to this. And don't worry, we are gonna. But before we finish, we're gonna have to address this because it's putting forth such a severe model here. Like here we are studying it all these years later. We have to ask the question. Well, wait a minute. But, do you have anything to say to us? What about us? Do you really mean to say that, like, all you old people, what are you gonna do? You can't really, no spirituality for you. Is that really what he's saying? That can't be, or at least if it is, we'll put this teaching aside. All right, but let's continue to try and understand what he's saying here when he's saying for the young, it's like the mountain, they're little mountain climbers. Dejas, what do you think?
I was thinking about the ways in which our tradition teaches how the mitzvot constitute a body. And so if you're born into this, your body is literally made by mitzvot from the beginning. Whereas those of us who have bodies made of other substances will have a different type of interaction with what it is to climb the mountain.
Yeah, good. I mean, there's a kind of, it's training. It's training, like, you like trained to be a mountain climber and your body develops in a certain way. And then you're a mountain climber. There's certain things that you just like, if you start early, it's not just language. The physical metaphor is really good.
Right, the gesture itself becomes second nature.
Yeah, certain just instincts and the bodily metaphor here is really important. It's just in you. It's like, and you have certain trained instincts, and there's just ways that I'm never going to be able to pick up certain kinds of physical movements anymore, So, birthday boy, Yonatan Reches. What do you have to say to us?
Yeah, well, for starters, you're right that this is exactly the sort of thing I'm thinking about these days with Chana around it. I don't have Chana in my hands right now. Mom took her, but my mom. But the reality is that we think about this subject very differently from how the Rebbe thought about it and how people who are deeply observant think about it. I mean, we think of Jewish education as kind of an intellectual exercise, right? Like, and not something that innately happens when you live in a Jewish home. We think of mitzvot and Jewish tradition as constructs, which they are, but the reality is that there are a lot of constructs in our lives that we don't teach as constructs, right? Like when we teach our children about money, we don't say money is this instrument that some people use in order to capture the significance of work and value, right? Like we just say, here's $20, you can use that to buy, I don't know, pick an item, right? And if these things are important to us, right? Like if we observe Shabbat and we keep a kosher home and we observe Shatnez and we pray 3 times a day and we do all these things, our children learn by being in that environment and by seeing these things. And then of course there's extra education that they get about, temple worship and whatever that they're not going to see at home. That's above and beyond. But it's not just a matter of cerebral learning. Like if these are things that we actually value and we actually practice, then we don't teach them as constructs. We teach them as reality. And at some point we teach children how to differentiate between objective reality and constructs.
Yeah, that's really, I'm not going to try and repeat the beauty and the sophistication of everything you just said, but I will say that what I was thinking while you were talking is what it might mean to have, like when you're raised up into something, and the kind of learning that is total, that's just like the way you live, then like what does it mean to have those you might be taught a childlike God when you're young, and you might have to at some point develop your conception of God, but what does it mean to just have that concept hovering around from the start? And you might come to understand that Shabbat is this incredibly like powerful idea that didn't need to be, that human beings ought to rest because God rests. And you're just going to get like Hashem gave us Shabbat, but eventually you have all these, everything's laid out there and it's in you, the infrastructure is built, and then you develop upon that, but it's a totally different, and I'll use the language metaphor one more time and just say, you know how it is when people who speak a language can't tell you any of the grammar rules. Are like, I don't know, you just, people speak Chinese, they're not going to tell you, oh, that's a 3/4 tone. It's like, I don't know, you just say the word like that. It's just in you. It's natural. It's like, okay, so there's something to that as well here. Now, I want to push us a little bit forward and give us the other side here. What about the rest of us? So first of all, let's just finish off what he says here. And I must say, there's a lot in these next lines that we're not going to be able to do full justice to because I don't even totally understand what he's saying, but you might as well have the full feeling. So the mountain climber and the trek, and you will always ascend. And here's how he finishes off the injunction, the message to the youth of Israel. Truly, youth of Israel, you're able to bring out inclinations and improvements from inside yourself, which you never imagined, that you yourself will still not understand. That's interesting, given what we've been saying. For example, you can develop a positive and strong will that is even stronger than you, to which your entire self will be subjugated, which you will be forced to follow against your own will without any excuses or equivocations. I'm sorry we don't have time to treat this because he's going into like more and more complicated realms here. You develop the ability to subjugate your own will stronger than the capacity that you would have. And think about a mountain climber being trained here. You become almost like superhuman in your abilities here. And then you will feel, somebody's unmuted, so if you can check that. You will feel inside yourself as if the Spirit of God that severs mountains and breaks down boulders is suddenly encountering you and lifting you up to this or that service. It will sever all the impediments and break down all the hindrances, for the eternal is God and you are God's servant and you are compelled to serve God. Now, that was a lot. And the only reason I almost didn't read it, the only reason I did is because I really did want to just note that here at the end, he uses the language of compelled. Mukhrach, you're compelled, you're forced to serve God. And he used that same language earlier to describe the older person who's trying really hard, but they force themselves. So I just want to throw that out there also as maybe part of the difference is that if you do it when you're young, you start to feel like God is, it's just like the whole tradition, it's all forcing you. You develop a will outside yourself, as opposed to always feeling like it's you who's like, come on, meditate again. Come on, you want to be better, Okay, but I'm afraid there's a lot there, and I have like, it's dangling. But I want to leave that for your further analysis, and instead turn to the question that Matt surfaced earlier, which is the question of, well, what does that mean for the rest? Does he really mean to say like, and I'm so sorry for you old folks, says no God for you, no Torah for you. So of course not. He addresses this in a separate piece. But I see a couple of hands up. I want to take the two hands are up, Robert and Jen, before I move forward. Robert?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so one of the things he said a little bit earlier, he said, you will reveal the greatness that is within you. And I thought that was, a lot of people talk about the greatness in people, but I think in this context, he's talking about getting in touch with B'Tselem Elokim, like the image of God that's inside you. And that he has this faith that this is what's going to happen in people. And if you get in touch with that, it's going to be much more powerful than you are and much greater than you could imagine it to be. I think that's a very inspiring vision. And it does remind me of Goethe saying, if there's something that you want to do in your life, begin it. And he says something like, once you begin it, it's going to take you over. It's going to be more powerful again than you are. And you'll be surprised at what happens when you do that.
Beautiful, Robert. Wow, thank you for that. So where are you calling in from, Robert?
I'm in North Carolina, in Chapel Hill, North Carolina.
Okay, such a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for that. I think that thank you especially because I just kind of trailed us off with some extra thoughts, but I actually think you're doing some of the work of making sense of where he goes here, because I think Robert's tracing a theme that we saw at the end there being developed, which is the idea that part of what you are developing yourself spiritually, but somewhat paradoxically, the more you develop your spiritual self, the less it's about yourself. The more that God, to use Goethe's language, takes over, right? Like, and there's the mystical part, and as Robert says, he seems to have a faith that that's there for all of us. But if you start cultivating it early, then the force seizes you early, and it's like God takes over in a way, and it's a very, we can think more about what, the implications, but that's a very powerful vision. So thank you for all of that, Robert. Jen?
Yeah, I think I started with a lot of cynicism around this because I work with kids, and most of them would hear this and go, and it strikes me like, it makes me ask who the target audience is for this. I'm so glad that you read the last piece because it's so passionate and hopeful. And I think it's speaking to the yearning and passion and hope of the older generation for the younger generation, always. We always have this passion and hope that that's what we're going to provide to young folks. And we never perfectly provide that. And every young generation always experiences itself on some level as a big failure to the hopes of the older generation too. So what I draw out of this is less like a literal idea of learning and cognitive function in young and old people, because it's just not that straightforward. And never has it been the case that we've perfectly raised a generation that completely is able to, like, physically in their flesh and spirit embody God and God's teachings, and more that yearning is the lesson from it. That hope for young people is the lesson from it, and the way we engage with young people to enact that hope.
Great. Thank you so much for that comment, because I think there are two important points there. There's one that you're making very, very pointedly, that there's a lot of, like, you see a lot of what generational aspirations look like here. Like, you're going to do it, kids. You'll do what we couldn't do. And I'm going to send you to Jewish school because I never had a Jewish education, right? You'll be the Jews, and I'm actually not going to have a Jewish education. You'll do it for me. Right. But there's a little inevitably, like, the children will, and so well said. Where was that generation where we formed perfect children? Right? But that's aspirational. And I just want to add to that, and I think it was implicit in your comments, that's true in the longing that we have for our children. And also, I do think, so far this could read just like it's for high schoolers. It's not for us to read anyway. But I think that part of the reason that this book is so well known, so important, is that it actually the description of the child there is an implicit yearning to have that experience, the childlike experience. And the question is, how can we're not just, oh, well, too bad, I guess I missed those days, but can I be like a child? Can I be, can I give in to the mountain climbing experience and just push myself further and develop those? I yearn for that. I want to see myself in that space too, wherever I'm at in my life. Okay, and with that, I want to turn now to the wait a minute, what about old people? Did the Piazzettes Rebbe really said that old people should not study Torah? So he says, no, that's not, God forbid, that's not what I mean. He says, it's not that we're saying here, not that that it will be impossible for those who do not begin the work of Chassidut in their youth and do not accustom their spirits to it from their childhood. I don't exactly know how to translate this, so that it should rise from the reed mats and shake off the piles of dirt that cover it. It is a little hard to translate, but I guess Chassidut is doing that. It's shaking off the dirt, so that, but that's a little bit of a funny sentence. Anyway, the sentence is, we're not saying that it'd be impossible for you to come to it afterwards or later. God forbid to say such a thing. The gates of heaven are always open to every Jew if they gird their loins and are willing to subjugate their powers to work and to carry. Lots of heavy lifting imagery there. And does the Mishnah that says, and one who learns in old age is compared to ink written on paper that has been written on and erased, intend to lock the gate in front of penitents who want to return to Torah in their old age? God forbid. No way. We're not saying that. But what are we saying? And look, okay, the answer is going to be relatively straightforward here. It's not like the difference is, however, is the amount of work required. The elder who wants to study Torah and to work at Hasidut must work 10 times, 100 times as much or even more than the child that begins studying early. And moreover, we can say that even one who devotes himself completely to the work of Hasidut in his older years, even if he attains it by much hard work, will nevertheless be forever lacking those periods of time that passed before he began his work. Okay, so the answer is relatively straightforward. Like, no, I'm not saying you shouldn't try to spiritually develop yourself, but I am saying that it's going to take you a lot more work. And I ask us actually to consider that because maybe it will take us a lot more work. And maybe I need to consider that. Like, it's going to take some extra effort to get there. And also, it's, not a fun thing to say, but you missed out. This is like the, begin now. Every day that you're not beginning, you miss out. Okay, I have 1 minute left here. So like he makes this point, and then he walks it back just a little bit, just not to throw the old person out of the Beit Midrash. And then he closes in a really interesting way, in a sort of like almost like a postscript or an afterthought or a problem actually that he hasn't considered before. And it is this: what about all of the founders of Hasidut? They were not boys. They were these old dudes. So, but this is where we get the tradition from. What about these old people who have these spiritual insight? These are our teachers. So again, I don't think his answer is that good. Check it out. Oh, this is besides the first Hasidim who lived in the days of the Baal Shem Tov and the Rebbe Baruch of Mezhebush. May the memory of the tzaddikim and the kadoshim be a blessing for life in the world to come. For they, even beforehand, were wholly beyond our comprehension. They and what they did were above time and nature. So they attained what they attained, even though they only began to work at Hasidut in their later years. Okay, that's not like what I would call a great answer. Like, there's this entire class of people. In fact, there are teachers. They're the people that started this very spiritual tradition that I'm encouraging that did not come to it in their early years because you couldn't have, because it didn't exist. But, they were holier than us. They're special. Shh, don't worry. Like that's not really an answer. And I'm just leaving it as a kind of a closing dilemma because it to me speaks more to the reality that there are all kinds of spiritual awakenings. And some of them happen among the very aged, and some happen among the very young, and some happen everywhere in between. The strict sort of methodology that he's laid out is flawed, and he knows it from his own lineage, but like he's trying to make a point, and it was a good point. I hope you found it to be a good point. It's like worth considering, but like, let's be clear, there are elderly spiritual avatars as well. And, it doesn't quite work to just say, well, you missed out if you're too old. So let's all work as hard as we can to discover that light inside of ourselves. But let's not get too caught up in where we're at the journey, because enlightenment is possible at any moment. So, okay, thank you everybody for learning with us.